back to the channel, but by request, this is a clinical analysis video on the video that I recently did on the invalidating therapist. You can go back and watch the original video, which I'll have in the link in the description, or you can just kind of like bounce in here and see what it's all about. Also, I have an upcoming therapist training in the level 1 of the RRP model, childhood trauma model that I do. That's March 5th, 2022 from 12 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You just click the white bubble in the corner. It has all the information if you want to register for that training. And that training is for therapists, holistic practitioners, and life coaches, or somatic people, whoever's interested in doing some work like this. And as a reminder, this what I'm critiquing here, or what I'm criticizing here, I'm not criticizing really models of therapy. CBT, mindfulness, everything has its own appropriate time. I mean, although I don't really like the blank slate stuff. But it's really, this video is really about the quality of the therapist and validating the client around that experience on that family visit in the role play. So here goes. So here's the clinical analysis, and we'll get right into it. So we got into the Uber, and our son was crying the whole way to the hotel, and later my wife and I bonded that we had done the right thing for us. But that night I got these intense texts from my dad, who was verbally abusive to me, and I had what I think is my first panic attack at like 3 a.m. And that's when I decided to call someone like you and try to get some help. Well, I understand, and that sounds like just typical stressful family life. I get it. Wow. But it must be devastating for a mother to be at odds with her son visiting her, having one other son withdraw for her completely, you know? Like, I think as we age, we perpetually lose connection with our children. Wow, I hadn't really thought about that. You know, family life is really difficult, and it takes a lot of patience and maturity to find ways that work. Especially nowadays, when there seems to be a whole movement around casual abandonment of family. You know, every generation has to define itself from the prior, but, you know, thinking of your mother in this, you know, well, this might be the best way that I can help you. You seem upset by this, and there's this wonderful quote, and I'll bet you'll never guess who said it. It goes something like, "Those who are the hardest to love need it the most." What do you think that means? I just kind of got a chill there. You know, part of me hates seeing my mother lose it like that. And I hate myself for causing all that. Does it mean that I haven't found a way to get her that love yet? Yep. You know, like clearly you didn't cause all that. But, you know, I think maybe you and your wife have a greater capacity. So with the apologist therapist, the first response of that therapist normalizes the abuse. And what bothers me about it is these are not typical family issues. They can be common and stuff, but he really minimizes that visit for the client by calling it, just like writing it off as like typical family stuff. What are you gonna do? And then it seems to me like right out of the gates, he's implying that your job and your wife's job is to try harder because your parents are limited, which is to greatly, greatly shame the client. I mean, they're not wrong about the parents being limited, but really dismissing their experience and putting the onus on them to be the better person is really can really mess with us as clients. And also notice to hear that the therapist only talked about and validated the mother's experience, not the client's, not even the wife's, not even the infant. So that's what I wanted to portray in this opening here. And your mother does, for patience and understanding. The quote is actually Socrates, and he was married to a woman similar to your mother. He knew this wisdom like over 2,000 years ago, you know? Perhaps it also explains your father. I don't know, maybe his, whatever that is, his reactivity, or maybe his investment in her. While they're both difficult people, but might not his strategy be related to the quote? Maybe like he's always doing things like in support of her because he feels just, I know what you're gonna say, but from what I truly believe in is that people are doing their best. And I wonder what would happen if you called them in a few days, or just wrote them a quick note and offer some kind of acknowledgement that the things like maybe the car ride or the lunch or showing you the high school, it's really important to not throw away any goodness in a person, even if things are conflictual. How might you feel if you did something like that and maybe own your part? Well, sure, but what would be my part? Well, your expectations. We all have to look at that. You were expecting a certain experience with them, so much to the point that you and your wife had a backup plan if you didn't get that experience. Maybe you're right. I think maybe the panic attack was about my selfishness in this. So yeah, maybe I can call them. I wonder how these relationships might look like if you show up with a different or no expectations and really look for the ways that they try, like the restaurant, like not well planned out, but what experience did they want from you and your wife and your son?
Okay, with the Socrates quote, the quote kind of highlights the therapist's agenda, which is instructing this client to be the better person or turn the other cheek or however you want to phrase that. The next kind of idea that I had in here when he started talking about the abusive father strategy, he's kind of flipped the script in it being an abusive father to being a role model of that agenda to turn the other cheek. It's almost like he's asking, does your father really have it all dialed in and figured out? And the client buys into that, which is not a good thing at all. The other piece is it's a pet peeve of mine, but I don't like that phrase, everybody is doing their best, when we talk about sort of a very abusive or toxic family system or an abusive person. Makes me ask the question, well, if that's their best, what's their worst? And, coming back to that frame point of the therapist portraying it all as sort of like, but they tried so hard on this visit too, and you're not seeing that kind of stuff. And lastly here is that really, really tough part when he sort of says, what is your part in this? The expectations and all that. That is a total shaming mind F for somebody that I see can exist in therapy. It can exist in the 12-step world, when we're doing sort of an inventory and amends and sort of what is called the turnaround. It's okay if you guys don't know what that is, but it can really sort of be a message similar to this. Well, it's like, well, that's what you wanted. You just wanted a nice visit for your infant son and whatever, which is when you really hear ourselves in that, like that's bananas. Of course they want that experience with a newborn and have this generational connection about it. So that's what I mean by that. And the last thought on the apologist here is I think it may be the most damaging type of therapist to the client's experience and their healing, because it really replicates the abusive family's main message, which is, oh, it's your fault. You've got this all wrong, which is, I'm sure you guys would understand that. So that's why I'm pointing out why I think the apologist might be the most damaging type of clinician we can experience.
So we got into the Uber, and my son was crying the whole way to the hotel, and later my wife and I bonded that we had really done the right thing for us. But that night I got these intense texts from my dad, who was verbally abusive to me, and I had what I think is my first panic attack at like 3 a.m. That's when I decided to call somebody like you, so... Well, thanks for all that. That's a lot to reconcile there. And I'm sure you're aware or you've heard that every family has disagreements, and how I work is I can help you come to your own conclusions or ways to figure out these relationships. My role is to be totally available to you and help you process. And I believe that people inherently know what they need to do or do what makes sense for them on their own terms. You just might need some help stepping into your greatness. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, I'd like that, I think. Have you maybe thought about maybe a course here about your family or what you'd like to see happen? No, I haven't really been able to sleep or eat. Like, I'm a bit overwhelmed. I was hoping that you'd have some ideas. The panic attack was so new that I don't even think about how anxious I've been through this. Yes, there. Let's start there. You're anxious. That's what we can work with here. Let's sit with it. Maybe become less critical of it. Tell me more about this anxious feeling. Well, I was shaking that night from those texts with my dad, and it's been on my mind ever since. Like, I keep seeing in my mind my father and my mother screaming at me in like the foyer. Like when we were leaving with our bags and the stroller, it was just awful. And I keep visually seeing my dad call me a piece of in front of my infant son. And, like what does all that mean for you?
So with the blank slate therapist, much like the apologist, there is in the beginning, or through the whole thing, there is no validation, and it is minimizing the abuse. And this time the person's just calling them disagreements, family disagreements. So that's one thing. The next piece, what I don't like about sort of general sort of blank slate therapist, they don't call themselves that. That's, but this idea that it's on you to figure it out. I'm just here to be present for you when you figured the thing out. And that's super old school, and I find it waste a lot of time. I think that clients need feedback and direction. That's me. Another piece is that they missed an opportunity to process the client's panic attack. All through these things, the client mentions that they had a panic attack. That's why they're seeking care from a therapist. And there's a missed opportunity for that person to kind of dive into it and really get into it. Then the other piece is what I really don't like about some messaging around therapy is we're looking at symptoms of whatever, and they're sort of saying, control your anxiety about the abuse, not validating that, of course, you're anxious around the abuse. So like their whole aim is to hear, oh, you're anxious, let's work with that anxiety, and disregard what had just happened on that visit.
That my family makes me anxious or I get anxious around them? Yes. But what might the anxiety you feel about all that might be telling you? Our feelings are like useful messages to us. Well, that maybe I'm wrong for visiting them, or that I put my wife through that because of my loyalty to them, or maybe my parents can't or refuse to keep it together for me or my son or my wife. Well, all that certainly makes one anxious, yes, if that's your inner experience. Can I ask though, might you maybe be inherently prone to anxiety? Might that be a pattern for you? Maybe it's telling you about the kind of person you might be. And how might it manifest again? Like say maybe when your son turns 1 and there's a question about how do you celebrate that with your parents? I don't know if I can do all that again. Well, I've always been keyed up about how things are going to go, what people think about me, like how am I doing at work, or in the past it was grades. Yes, well, we all want to do well, which can make us anxious, but I think you could be onto something and perhaps coming to terms with your relationship to your anxiety. And I wonder if more sessions will help you work on that anxiety and simply make friends with it. Okay. Yeah, I guess that sounds all right.
And here with the blank slate therapist is I find that they might take you down the rabbit hole where with so many questions or not being direct, where the client, like, where are we? What is this therapist getting at? Being really indirect and just trying to guide the client to do all that is really kind of mind-effy. I just find that because in a way, it's like the therapist is sort of saying, I want you to figure out the answer that's in my head for what I think is best. So there's that. The other piece, coming back to the anxiety, it's like, it's your fault you're anxious around this whole thing, which is incredibly invalidating. And lastly is sort of the message of, indirectly said, is that it's not your toxic family, it's your anxiety. Are you prone to anxiety? Are you genetically wired for it? And they took it to there, and really avoiding the elephant in the room, which is like what happened to this client on this visit and in their childhood and the parents' sort of behavior, the parents' mental health, and pinning it all on a flaw around the client. So there's that.
So we got into the Uber and my son was crying the whole way to the hotel, and later my wife and I bonded together and decided that we had done the right thing for us. But that night I got these intense texts from my dad, verbally abusing me. And I think what I had was my first panic attack at 3 a.m. And that's when I decided to call someone like you. So, wow. Well, I just completed this training on mindfulness and I'm so into it. The basic idea is that you become aware of everything you're going through and pay attention to it, but you're more curious about what you're going through instead of reacting to it. I have this handout, I think, I think it could be at home or in a PDF or something, but I'll email it to you. But related to your family, though, I have a friend who just went through something really similar with their family, and it was so stressful for them. But they started to practice just being still and welcoming what comes up in that stress. Do you meditate? No, I haven't, but I've heard good things. Well, we'll have to change that. And, I was raised Catholic, but my parents would disown me if they knew I was trying to meditate. But maybe yours would too, Well, actually, that's one thing about them that they're pretty open to. Well, cool. Well, back to mindfulness. And if this isn't your thing, I have some CBT sheets that we can do if you're interested in that.
So with the novice, with the training, what I'm trying to portray there is somebody who is way too casual, has poor boundaries themselves, and they have this, oh my God, you have to try mindfulness, you have to try this thing kind of vibe. We can expect that from a friend that's like, oh my God, I went to this yoga retreat and it was amazing, it changed my life, or two, you have to try it, you have to go to this place. It's that kind of vibe coming from this therapist that puts them into a position of more being the client's peer, and it's like way too pally cakes, it's way too BFF. You might get this from an experienced therapist or an immature therapist. The other piece is that they totally invalidated the client by skipping over everything that the client said about the abuse around the visit and the panic attack. They didn't even address it. They just said, hey, I took a training, The other piece is a kind of a pet peeve of mine is this idea of a la carte therapy. It's like, well, we could do some of this, we could do some of that, whatever you like, some mindfulness, some CBT. I really think for childhood trauma, we should be sort of seeing somebody who only deals with that or only is really rooted in trauma. And when someone might ask me, what do I look for in a therapist? I would give them the usual websites where therapists are listed. And I tell them, find somebody who only lists a couple things that they're really good at. Not that they do everything under the sun and they're trained in everything under the sun and they address everything from the diagnosis of bipolar to Alzheimer's disease and they're an all-around person. I just feel like the therapist is covering way, way too much ground. And they might be really good. It's sort of, you have to interview people, but it's a personal pet peeve of mine. I think a therapist should be good at a really, really couple things that they're interested in, and that's their whole gig. Not everything under the sun. It's a little bit of a red flag.
But the goal is you practice being chill and having some control over your feelings and issues instead of being taken over by them. Did the thing with your mom take you over? Yeah. I haven't been able to sleep or eat. I'm worried I'm going to have another panic attack if my father texts me. Right. Tell me more. Well, I had a panic attack when my dad texted me because he was verbally abusive and I can't stop thinking about it. Yeah, I bet. How did it feel in your body? I don't know, tense, shaking, my shoulders and my neck muscles are all locked up, I can't focus. I'm surprised I wasn't late to this. Oh yeah, so sorry I was late. And good that we're maybe both late, but I'm sorry I was 20 minutes late, but we'll have to end soon because unfortunately I can't go beyond longer. But what else? I'm exhausted. I can't sleep. Got it. They taught us in this training this really cool exercise that I want you to try to do when you leave. They're all sensory, I think. There's touch, smell, hearing, feeling. So what you do the next time you eat something today, your next meal, you eat super slow and you savor and you think about all the flavors and textures that you're experiencing. If you're listening in the car and you try to shut off all the noise in your head and you try to just think about what kind of sensations is the music causing. Or if you're a tactile person, you sit in your car and you close your eyes and you feel your keys, like as if you were blind, like going over, are they cold? Are they sharp? Even the plastic gas card things, like what are they like? Are they smooth? Are they frayed? And I know it sounds odd, but all of these are research proven ways to calm your system down. And you kind of ground while you're doing all that. And if you're grounded, you're less anxious and you're able to get through things better. Works so well. I love doing it. I kind of like that. Do I do it when my father texts me again? Yes. You know, there's this great Instagram person that does mindfulness that I think you should follow. I think your Instagram was in your email, and what I can do is I can follow you and then send you a DM with the person's account, and they're so helpful with that stuff. And would you say coming into this session, would you say the main thing for you is anxiety? Well, yeah, I did have my first panic attack. Maybe GAD? I'm sorry, what? Oh, generalized anxiety disorder. I have to put in like this working diagnosis, and since I was late, I couldn't get to the form, but maybe we can do all that next time. Okay.
Here I'd like to point out the discussion with the novice is that many therapists are only into managing symptoms and not the roots or the cause of those symptoms. And that's what the mindfulness, and again, I'm not against mindfulness. I do a lot of mindfulness myself, but really just keeping it to a surface level of just do these things and you'll be fine when it doesn't address what the client needs. Another pet peeve of mine is obviously sort of the therapist voice. Many childhood trauma survivors can sense fakeness and inauthenticity. And when we use a therapist's voice in a way that doesn't feel like genuine or real or whatever, and it seems scripted or, it's gonna feel manipulative. Because it almost kind of is. It almost, maybe that's not exactly fair, but it makes people feel icky, I find. I can't stand it myself. But then when you zero in on the session that the therapist is talking about being mindful about our car keys, when the client was talking about how their father called them a POS. And it's a little bit like with the other one, where are we? What are we doing here? So there's an idea around that. The client, the therapist here, obviously sort of like, I'll befriend you, I'll follow you on Instagram and blah, 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 blah. Maybe the client doesn't want that person to see their family life. Maybe the client doesn't want to see the therapist's family life or whatever. So obviously sort of needs some supervision and training. And lastly on this one, I find that therapists like this, are overcompensating for either their own family stuff or their own issues or their nervousness and incompetence, and they greatly need some supervision. I want to be fair here in a way that, of course, I was green when I started, you know what I mean? But it's in a way that some are more greener than others, I guess, is what I'm trying to say there. So there's that.
So we got into the Uber, and our son was crying the whole way to the hotel, and later my wife and I bonded that we had done the right thing for us. But that night, I get these intense texts from my dad verbally abusing me, and I had what I think was my first panic attack at like 3 a.m. That's when I decided to call someone like you. Whoa. I can totally see why you had a panic attack, which are awful things, by the way. And, I think you and your wife really did the right thing. That is so not normal. That's so not a healthy family experience, especially around meeting a newborn. Thanks. I was worried you were going to tell me that that's not real abuse or something. Oh no, that's all way up there. There's verbal abuse, manipulation, emotional abuse, the control, and that's a total nightmare that I actually relate to. And I like that you and your wife left. It's really good parenting. It's funny, but I often ask when I start with new clients who has children of their own, like what kind of grandparents did their parents become? And you've kind of answered that already. Can I maybe ask you a tough question? Sure. Your parents, in my experience, or parents like this, their behavior isn't usually a new thing. Like there could be a cognitive decline, something like dementia or Alzheimer's, but were they like this growing up with you? Yeah. Yeah, like my brother and I, we did this stuff like we would hide in closets because my father would get enraged and start hitting us. My mother was very embarrassing to be out in public with because she would often start fights with anybody, like the bank person, the grocery store person. She'd even get into arguments with teachers. We couldn't have friends over because we wouldn't want them to hear what our house was like. And I remember this nice family that I felt terrible to be around because they were so chill and normal. They were our neighbors who only lived there for about 2 years or so and moved because my parents kind of made them enemies and would mess with them about anything, like all the time. God, that sounds like such an ordeal for a little boy, you know? Kids who grow up like that live in with their nervous system on high alert 24/7 in a family like that. Can I maybe?
So here is where I, give myself an A++, and this is going to seem, this is hard to just critique the way that I think it should go down. And I'm not saying here that my brand of therapy or my style is the best. The things I want to cover here is the client came in with this horrific family visit and is questioning childhood trauma or needs some guidance around that. And I wanted to see what it looks like when a therapist can validate all that in a very real way. So that's kind of what I'm getting here. And yes, I am talking about how I would do it in therapy, which, therapists, that we're really attached to our models of therapy. And I think it's just kind of how it goes. But this is also what it was like for me when I first got to therapy. It's like I had a very validating person who got this stuff. So it's just hard for me to hear about these other sort of experiences. So there's that kind of caveat there. So the first thing to look at is where this therapist validated the panic attack up front and really kind of celebrated the client and the wife for choosing to leave and setting the boundary. It's like getting really good feedback. You did the right thing there. I think that clients need to hear that. This therapist educated on toxic family systems and normal expectations, very much unlike the apologist, is like, of course you would want to introduce your newborn son to your parents and sort of have that be a loving experience. You're not wrong for wanting that or assuming that. So the other piece is educated on how the toxic, or questioned how the toxic parents in childhood, what are they like now as grandparents? And it kind of spells out, it tells us a lot when we look at that question. Another is that this therapist was validating the early abuse and the trauma conditioning and was kind of going there, connecting the dots between past and present.
Like that. Can I maybe ask about maybe if you and your wife had been on the same page through this, or maybe do you also talk with your brother about your parents? Good question. Well, most of my marriage has been me trying to get my parents, give them chances that my wife tries to get me to stop giving them. And it's always been a thing between us. And I just can't bring myself to not deal with them. But I envy and even resent how my brother just was like, see ya, I'm out. And now, how do you and your wife talk about it after this visit? Well, she's always been super patient and understanding, but I can't ask her to go there anymore. I'm riddled with guilt about not talking with them or even seeing them because it's always, always toxic. I totally get it. And, that tells us that maybe you're stuck, which is so common for this family system stuff. Abusive family systems have these very specific rules that stay with us into our adulthood, and those rules keep us stuck. Can you maybe tell me about a time growing up where you had to say maybe no to your parents or state a preference? Can you give me an example? Yeah, sure. Something that you wanted to do for yourself, but that would have huge consequences if you did that. Sure. Well, I always have this memory. I remember in middle school where there was this talent show. And my friends and I did this skit from the show In Living Color. Do you remember Fire Marshal Bill? Yeah, oh my God. We couldn't get enough of that growing up. We loved that show. Well, I was Bill. And we did this whole elaborate thing where we even had a fake fire extinguisher that was full of baby powder. And that Saturday at the talent show, my mother had this meltdown where we weren't, I don't know, caring enough for her or appreciative enough for her. And it was really bad, like worse than normal bad. And my dad starts swearing at us, and like they'd pick something, our grades, our bikes. And in the middle of all that, I tell them that I have to go to this talent show. And my mother just absolutely lost it, saying me leaving was so typical and that I was horrible to her. And she sobbed uncontrollably and locked herself in her room. And then my dad went off on us, and you can hear him all the way through the neighborhood. And I finally got him to stop yelling, because by telling him I wasn't going to go to the show. And then I go to my mother's door and to tell her I wasn't going to go, and she didn't say anything. She just sobbed and told me to get away from her. Then I remember being in my room really spaced out and was worried about, like, what am I going to tell my friends? Because I ghosted them, and I'd have to say something on that Monday. Like, I was thinking about lying that I got into a car accident or something, but I think they all knew that my family was really weird. Like, my friends were used to me having to leave a sleepover because my mother would call and demand that I needed to come home because of a dish or something. God, that's heartbreaking. You know, kids growing up in that abuse really have basic things get wrecked for them by the parenting. And healthy parenting would have just been so into seeing you do that skit and not sabotage it like that. How I work in sessions is, I help clients work with their inner child who is stuck in that old system, and help them develop their healthy adult who can make better choices for themselves or stop doing things that aren't good for them, like a visit like this. And here's what I mean. That story that you just told me about the talent show, is that related to the visit that you just had with your parents? Yeah, I guess it is. Like, I guess I'm still accepting blame for their insanity, or I'm choosing the wrong thing. Like, I choose them over the show, or I choose them now over my wife or my family or whatever. Yes, exactly. But you and your wife, you did choose your son, and you choose yourselves this time. I did, yeah.
So here I'd like to note how the therapist was exploring around the wife and the brother to kind of get a consensus going on how other people experience the parents, meaning that does anyone else get it? Does anyone else can be sort of rally around the client and sort of help them as a good, healthy kind of like home base for what the parents are actually like? And here the client is kind of on the fence, which is a good thing. And this client just needs help around the family abuse, because it's like a client like this is half getting it. But again, and I'm sure you will relate to this, their shame and their guilt will keep them stuck. And related to that the therapist exploring the origins of that shame and guilt, asking them, how might this have manifested when you were, say, 12? We need that content to spell out. It's like, of course you have struggle with shame and guilt. It's sort of like you were marinating in it through that whole child experience with those parents. And they related that early abuse to the present stuck place around this visit, around the boundaries, around loyalty. It's like, of course you're struggling with that, given like what you were kind of conditioned by your parents and all that stuff.
Yeah. But I still feel totally ashamed of myself about it, though. I think that that's what the panic attack was about. Right. Well, you're going to do really well in this, because that's because our inner child still believes that old system stuff. Stuff like, I'm a bad kid. I caused my mother's emotions. I deserve to get physically and verbally abused by dad because I caused all this and they're trying. Like, whoa, you're nailing me a bit too hard there. Sorry, but that resonates? Yep. And over time, we work on this system. We talk about what and how a healthy family system would operate, because most clients don't have a good frame of reference for that. And we start to break some rules for this inner child by holding the toxic parents accountable for how they were abusive. Like, what rules? Well, this is big, and most people take a while and work up to it, but breaking the loyalty rule, which is something like, it doesn't matter how abusive I am to you, you still have to show up for me, and it's your fault I'm like this. Like, breaking that rule. That's a rule I'd love to break. Good. And some clients will maybe work towards a cutoff to get space, to get healthier. Like we'd first establish a new rule that everyone's responsible for their own feelings, especially your parents who blame, shame, and attack people for their feelings. Another rule is having your own life and doing your own thing and doing your parenting your own way isn't selfish or betraying anybody. That's also a great rule. So we're breaking rules, we're creating new ones, and you're in a process now, I think, that those who grow up in abusive families try to push the feelings down and just try to make it work. And then one day you kind of hit bottom with it all. For a lot of people, it happens on a visit like you just had, where the wheels came off and it was undeniably off the rails and not safe and not okay. And that's actually a really good place to be because, you see your family for who they really are. And from where I sit, your parents are incredibly emotionally off, probably maybe even potentially mentally ill given how you're describing this. And I say that because it doesn't sound like they're aware of themselves and they quickly provoke and attack and they can't seem to self-regulate their emotions. There's a lot of victim-y perpetrator stuff, which isn't safe for your little family, especially even you. Like when your mother was saying, like, why are you doing this to your wife and all that is just, that's tough to take in, but it's helpful. What do you mean safe for me? So you and your wife are good parents and you want to protect your son from adult issues that are really off or overwhelming. But if it's not safe for him, your son, or if it's not safe for your wife, why is it safe for you to be in the crosshairs? That's a really good point. So it's my inner child that wants to make things okay with my parents? Yes, good. The inner child still lives in this kind of fantasy that the parents will change or be more loving if you present or you show up in a certain way, but it never works. That's very true. I already feel like I'm more in the reality about that visit, about how abusive it was and insane. And not just in an intellectual way. I feel like I emotionally get it just sitting here. Great, I'm glad. And that means that your inner child feels seen. And, we gotta go in just a minute, but I'd really like you to pick up a book. This is Bradshaw's, Bradshaw's Homecoming, and I'd like you to read the first 4 chapters. It really nails what happens to kids in terms of abuse and shame and stuckness in our adulthood. And it's also just helpful to define what abuse is. I'll get it. Thank you. This is really helpful.
And in this last segment here, what the therapist is doing is they're educating the client on childhood abuse, the belief system around that abuse, like in CBT, like its core beliefs. These are more sort of trauma-focused core beliefs. The therapist educates on family rules that run trauma survivors in their present life and start a discussion about breaking those rules to empower the client. The therapist also educates on what might a healthy family system look like, which is huge. We can name the bad stuff till the cows come home, but it doesn't really sink in unless we contrast it with what's healthy and what would be normal. Also, kind of educating the client around, all of us have, for childhood trauma survivors, it's a good thing, but most of us hit a bottom with our family system, like a visit like this, like a Thanksgiving or a Christmas or whatever. And hitting that bottom with our family is a good thing because it sort of begins the process of change. And meaning that it's when we have a crisis like this client is experiencing, there's a lot of opportunity in a crisis like this to really take stock in like what's going on and what is something I'm still ignoring that I really need to pay attention to. And lastly is that the therapist there is educating on what it's like to be emotionally safe versus just being submissive and acting in a selfless way. Like if that client could not bear sort of like leaving the parents and all that shame and guilt and all that toxic belief system stuff, and they stayed there, they're not in a safe place at all, and they're more sort of acquiescing to the mess, which really I think is the worst of our childhood traumas. When we acquiesce, we really give up ourselves. We start to really sort of feel living in quiet desperation. We really let ourselves down in that way. So the therapist trying to like support them in that. If it's not safe for your wife or your son, it's not safe for you. So I hope that this video was helpful to you guys. Check out the training if you're in this world of the healing arts in any way. And if you like the video at all, I'd love to hear from you, some ideas, some questions, some comments. And as always, I will see you next time. May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease. And may you be joyous. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.